He had everything. And in 30 seconds, a child's question was about to burn it all down. The ballroom gleamed, 500 guests in black tie, champagne catching light like liquid gold. Luca Moretti stood at the top of his empire, carved from blood, silence, and years of burying what hurt. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. Tonight, he would announce Vanessa Sinclair as his future, close the door on the past, and never look back. Then a small body collided with his leg, and a boy of 5 looked straight up at him with eyes the color of winter storm clouds, eyes that Luca had only ever seen in the mirror, and asked the one question no one in that room was prepared for. "Mister, why do you have the same eyes as me?" If you've ever watched a man's entire world crack open in public, stay with this story until the end. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom had been transformed into something that looked less like a party and more like a declaration of war dressed in white orchids and candlelight. That was always how Luca Moretti operated. Every move deliberate, every detail a message. The orchids alone had cost $40,000, flown in from Thailand because the florist had made the mistake of suggesting domestic alternatives, and Luca had looked at the man with those flat gray eyes until the conversation ended itself. 500 guests. Senators, judges, city councilmen who owed favors. Old money families who smiled with their teeth and kept their hands visible at all times around men like Luca. CEOs who laundered their consciences by standing in the same room as him and telling themselves it was just business. And beneath all of it, like iron rebar inside decorative plaster, the quiet presence of the Moretti organization, 12 of his best men distributed through the room in tuxedos, earpieces invisible, eyes tracking every door. Luca stood near the far end of the room beside the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Fifth Avenue. Outside, snow was coming down in slow, deliberate sheets, the kind of snowfall that muffled the city into something almost gentle. He didn't look at it. He hadn't found anything gentle in 5 years. He was 41 years old and looked like he'd been assembled from harder material than other men. 6'2", shoulders that filled a jacket without effort, dark hair with the first threads of silver at the temples that his barber had offered to correct and been told, quietly, to leave alone. His face was the face of a man who had stopped apologizing for what he was sometime around his mid-30s. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and pale now, a reminder from a meeting that had gone wrong in Providence 8 years ago. He'd left that meeting in better condition than the other 2 men present. That was as much as anyone needed to know. His expression tonight was what his inner circle privately called the gala face. Controlled, politely engaged, eyes that cataloged the room in continuous slow sweeps without appearing to move at all. He held a glass of Barolo that he had not drunk from in 40 minutes. At his right shoulder, his consigliere Marco Vitale leaned in and said something about the Ferraro family representatives arriving late. Luca made a small sound that meant he'd heard. Across the room, near the string quartet playing something seasonal that he had already tuned out, Vanessa Sinclair moved through a cluster of city officials with the specific kind of grace that came not from breeding, but from relentless study of how power behaved in rooms like this. He watched her work the room and felt the thing he always felt when he watched Vanessa, a clean, functional appreciation. She was beautiful in a precise architectural way. Dark red dress, dark hair swept up, smile calibrated perfectly between warmth and distance. She was smart. She understood his world without needing it explained. She had never once asked him about the parts of his life that existed outside the law, which he respected more than almost anything. She was, by every measure he had been able to construct over the last 18 months, an appropriate choice. That word, appropriate, sat in the middle of his chest like a stone he'd grown used to carrying. "Ferraro's not coming," Marco said, quieter this time. "Just heard from Sal. His people sent word an hour ago. Schedule conflict." "There's no such thing as a schedule conflict on Christmas Eve," Luca said. His voice was even. "He's sending a message." "What kind of message?" Luca took a single sip of wine. "The kind I'll need to answer in January." He turned slightly, tracking the movement near the main entrance. "Where's the announcement?" 40 minutes. "You want it after the dinner service?" He nodded once. 40 minutes. In 40 minutes, he would stand in front of 500 people and tell them that Vanessa Sinclair was the future of the Moretti family, that she would sit beside him, carry his name, stand as proof that Luca Moretti had moved forward from whatever wreckage existed behind him. It was the right move. It was a consolidating move. It would communicate stability to the families who watched him for signs of weakness, and it would communicate permanence to the legitimate world that he needed to believe in his front businesses. It was the right move. He had spent 5 years making right moves. The room shifted in the way rooms shift when they've reached a certain density of bodies and alcohol. Conversations getting louder, the music pressed back into the edges, a loosening that happened even to careful men after their third glass. Luca moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that if you don't create friction, people part around you without needing to be asked. He was rounding the far end of the dinner tables, heading toward the alcove where Marco's men had set up a quiet space for him to take a private call from the accountant in Zurich. Legitimately, the least interesting call of his year, but one that needed to happen before January, when the collision occurred. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. A small body moving fast and low, ducking between two guests who hadn't noticed him, cutting across the open floor with the absolute confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the world contains spaces not meant for him. The boy hit Luca's leg at approximately knee height and bounced backward 2 steps, landing solidly on his feet with the automatic physical competence of a child who falls down frequently and has gotten good at recovering. He looked up. Luca looked down. The child was 5, maybe just turned 6. Dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. A small formal outfit. White dress shirt, dark pants, the shirt already partially untucked, that suggested someone had put significant effort into his appearance, and he had spent the evening systematically dismantling it. His shoes were good leather shoes, and one of them had come unlaced. But Luca Moretti, whose threat assessment was as automatic as breathing, didn't register any of that first. What he registered were the eyes. The color hit him somewhere old and buried, in a place he had spent 5 years constructing walls around. The boy's eyes were gray. Not the common pale gray, but the specific deep storm cloud gray that Luca had inherited from his father, that his father had inherited from his, that had shown up in the Moretti line for 3 generations and nowhere else that Luca had ever encountered in another human being. He stood perfectly still. The child tilted his head with the frank, unselfconscious curiosity that exists only in people who haven't yet been taught to edit their observations, and said, "Mister, why do you have the same eyes as me?" The 2 guests nearest them went quiet first. Then the quiet spread outward in a radius, the way a stone dropped in still water sends rings to the edges. The string quartet finished their phrase and paused between pieces. In the space of approximately 7 seconds, a roughly 20-foot circle of the ballroom fell into a silence that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with the instinct that something was happening that you should watch. Luca's gala face did not move. Everything behind it did. He crouched down slowly, the movement unhurried, controlled, the way he did everything, and looked at the child at eye level. Up close, the resemblance delivered itself like a physical impact, detail by detail. The structure of the boy's face, the set of his jaw, the slight downward angle of the brows when he was concentrating, which the boy was doing now, studying Luca with the same careful gray eyes that Luca used to study rooms. "What's your name?" Luca asked. His voice came out level. He was very good at keeping his voice level. The boy considered whether to answer with the brief, assessing pause of a child who has been taught to be careful with strangers. Then, "Noah." "Noah." He kept his voice neutral. "Noah what?" "Noah Rossi." The name landed somewhere in Luca's chest with a weight that had nothing to do with air. Rossi. He heard Marco take a single step behind him. He heard the ambient noise of the room begin to reconstitute itself as guests processed that whatever they had almost witnessed was apparently not going to resolve itself visibly, and began returning to their conversations with the slightly elevated energy of people who have been given something to discuss. Luca stayed crouched. He looked at the boy, Noah, who was now examining Luca with equal and completely guileless intensity. "How old are you, Noah?" "5. A pause. "And 3/4, stated with the severity of someone who considers the fraction non-negotiable. 5 3/4. Luca kept his face still. His mind was doing something he had no framework for. It was not calm calculation. It was not the cold assessment of a threat. It was something cracking open that he had sealed shut so thoroughly he had almost forgotten the shape of it. "Are you someone important?" Noah asked. "People keep doing that thing where they look at you and then look away real fast." "What thing?" "That." The boy demonstrated, a quick sliding glance followed by an immediate return to neutral. It was, Luca realized, a perfect impression. "My mom says that means someone is either important or scary." "Maybe both," Luca said. Noah considered this with the gravity it deserved. "My mom says those are usually the same thing." "Your mom sounds like a smart woman." "She is," said with complete conviction. "She's the smartest person. She says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but you don't feel like a stranger." He frowned slightly, working through this apparent logical contradiction. "You feel like Noah." The voice came from Luca's left. Behind him, he heard Marco go absolutely still. The specific stillness of a man receiving information his nervous system doesn't yet know how to process. Luca stood up. He turned slowly, the way you turn when some part of you already knows what you're going to see and is trying to give itself one more second before it becomes irrevocable. Elena Rossi had not changed the way people change when you've tried to convince yourself they have. She was 34 now. He could do the arithmetic without trying. And the 5 years had done what 5 years do. Sharpened some things, settled others. She was thinner than he remembered, and there was a quality to the way she held herself that was different, something that had been added through weight-bearing rather than removed. The posture of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has made their peace with the carrying. Her hair was dark and worn down tonight, and she was in a dark green dress that suggested she'd been someone's +1 or had been working the event. He couldn't tell which yet. She had a small clutch bag pressed against her side, and her face, when she saw him, went through 3 things in rapid succession: recognition, horror, and then a controlled mask that he recognized because he'd watched her construct it. She'd learned it from him, years ago, when he'd taught her without meaning to, that sometimes you had to put your face somewhere safe while the rest of you dealt with the impact. She crossed the distance in 8 steps, and her hand closed around Noah's shoulder with the automatic practice speed of a woman who has spent 5 years being the only wall between her child and the world. "Noah, come here." Her voice was steady. He gave her credit for that. "Mom, I was just talking." "I know." She steered him gently but without negotiation. "Come on." She didn't look at Luca again. That was what told him everything. In the entire 5 years, in the whole geography of loss he had mapped and remapped in his head, he had assumed that if he ever saw her again she would look at him. With guilt, with defiance, with whatever emotion accompanied the particular choices she'd made. She would look at him because that was what you did when you faced the accounting. She didn't look at him. She looked at her son, and she moved. Luca said, "Elena." She stopped. Noah turned and looked up at his mother with the clear-eyed, uncomplicated curiosity of a child in the presence of adult tension he can sense but not yet name. Elena turned back slowly. Her eyes met his for the first time in 5 years, and what he saw there was not what he had spent 5 years expecting to find. There was no guilt. There was no defiance. What was in her eyes was something closer to grief, the kind that has been lived with long enough to become structural, something you build your days around rather than a thing that arrives. And underneath it, moving fast beneath the surface like something trying not to be seen, fear. "This isn't the time," she said quietly. "You don't get to decide that." "Luca, not here." He glanced at Noah, who was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child cataloging information. He looked back at her. "Stay." It wasn't a request, it wasn't quite a command. It was something in between that only existed in the specific vocabulary they'd built between them years ago, before everything, in the language that 2 people construct when they've spent enough time in each other's spaces that words start to carry more weight than their surface meaning. She understood it. He saw her understand it. And for one moment he saw something else, something she couldn't control in time. A flash of the particular pain of someone who has been carrying a secret so long they've almost forgotten it has a shape, being forced to remember its edges. 5 minutes, she said. "Outside," he said. "Now." He caught Marco's eye across the room. The look he sent communicated, "Stay with them." Marco, who had been with Luca for 11 years and could read his face the way other men read text, gave a small nod, and positioned himself without appearing to. Luca walked toward the side corridor that led to the private terrace, and he heard Elena follow him. He didn't look back to check. The cold was already coming through the glass doors at the end of the hall, and the snow was still falling outside over Fifth Avenue, and the sounds of the gala fell away behind him like water receding. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about having trained himself for 15 years to keep his hands steady in moments of maximum pressure. It worked even when the pressure was not the kind you could shoot your way out of. The terrace was empty, swept clean by staff earlier, and now dusting over again with snow. The cold hit him through his jacket immediately. He didn't register it. He turned and faced her. Elena stepped through the door and pulled it closed behind her. The noise from inside became a murmur, then almost nothing. The snowfall was the loudest thing. The specific white silence of snow, which was not silence at all but a different frequency of sound. She looked at him. He looked at her. 5 years of constructed absence collapsed into approximately 3 feet of cold air between them. "How old is he?" Luca said. Not a question. The arithmetic had already finished running. "Luca! Elena!" His voice dropped to something quieter, which was, in his experience, more dangerous than loud. "How old?" She didn't look away. Whatever else had happened, whatever 5 years had done, she still had that. The ability to hold his gaze in the moments that mattered. "5," she said. 5 3/4. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved. That was all. Outside the wall he'd built, the full weight of it was there. 5 years. A child. Everything. Pressing against something structural that had not yet decided whether to hold. "He has my eyes," Luca said. "Yes. And my family's pendant." He had seen it at the last moment, through the open collar of the boy's dress shirt. The small silver pendant. Saint Christopher, 3 generations of Moretti men, handed to Luca by his father the night before his father died. Luca had given it to Elena. He remembered the night. He remembered the exact angle of light through the window of her apartment and the exact weight of her head against his chest and the feel of the chain in his fingers as he'd placed it around her neck. That was the night he had understood, clearly and without ambiguity, that he was going to spend the rest of his life with this woman. 3 weeks later, she was gone. "I can explain. You're going to." He moved to the terrace railing and put both hands on it and looked out at the snow over Fifth Avenue and breathed in the cold air and let it settle whatever was happening in his chest into something he could work with. "But not here. Not tonight." He turned back. "Tomorrow." "I don't think that's tomorrow," he said again. "You walk away from this terrace and I will find you, Elena. You know I can. And you know that if I have to find you, the conversation we have will be different than the one we could have if you come to me." She was quiet for a long moment. The snow came down. Inside, muffled, the string quartet had started again. Something slow, something recognizably seasonal. "I'm staying at the Harrington," she said finally. "On 46th. I know the Harrington." He said it without expression. He'd had a meeting there 6 months ago that had ended in a financial arrangement beneficial to the Moretti organization and uncomfortable for a state senator. He kept this to himself. She nodded once, started to turn, stopped, turned back. "He doesn't know," she said. "About you. I want you to understand that before tomorrow. He doesn't know who you are. He knows he has a father. He knows that father doesn't know he exists. That's what I told him when he was old enough to ask." She paused. "He's never asked for more than that. He will." Luca looked at her for a long time. "And what have you been planning to tell him when he does?" Something moved through her face, something that cost her. "The truth," she said quietly, "when I could figure out how to tell it." She went back inside. Luca stood on the terrace alone with his hands on the railing and the snow coming down over the city. He stood there for 4 minutes. He counted them. It was a technique he'd developed years ago for moments when the thing happening in his chest needed somewhere to go before it became something he acted on. 4 minutes. Breathe. Let the cold work. At the end of 4 minutes, he turned around, straightened his jacket, and went back into the gala. The announcement was in 31 minutes. He found Marco near the drink service and said, "I need everything you can pull on Elena Rossi in the next 2 hours. Address history, employment, Any known associations, financial records if you can get them clean. Marco looked at him steadily. The announcement runs on schedule, Luca said. Start the search. Marco hesitated one additional beat, which, for Marco, constituted a significant expression of concern, and then took out his phone. Luca walked back to the center of the ballroom. Vanessa materialized at his side from somewhere to the left, sliding her hand through his arm with the practiced ease of a woman who had been studying the architecture of being beside this particular man. "You were gone," she said. Not accusatory, observational. She was smart enough to know the difference. Needed air. She accepted this. She always accepted this. It was one of her better qualities, and also, he was beginning to understand, one of the reasons something in him stayed at a specific distance from her that he had never quite been able to close. The dinner service ended. The room rearranged itself for the announcement. Luca stood at the front with a microphone handed to him by the evening's MC, a man who knew exactly which payments kept him employed, and looked out at 500 faces turned toward him. He made the announcement. The words came out the way they were supposed to. Vanessa stepped forward at the right moment and stood beside him with her hand in his, and her smile calibrated exactly right. The room applauded. There were toasts. His people in the room maintained their positions and their expressions. Through all of it, in the rear peripheral vision that he never fully turned off, he tracked the corner of the room where Marco had positioned himself near a table occupied by a woman in a dark green dress and a 5-year-old boy who had fallen asleep against her arm. The boy's face in sleep was completely unguarded. Luca looked at it once across the ballroom and looked away. He shook hands and accepted congratulations for 45 minutes after the announcement. Vanessa moved through the room beside him and handled the social mechanics with the precision he'd come to rely on. He said the right things. He let the right people photograph him. He did not let his face do anything it shouldn't. At 11:47, he excused himself to the private elevator that took him up to the suite the hotel maintained for his use on these occasions. Marco was waiting outside the elevator when it opened. "She's been living in Bridgeport," Marco said. "Moved there 3 years ago. Before that, she was in Boston. Before that, Philadelphia. She moves every 18 to 24 months. He handed Luca a folded sheet. "She's been working under a corporate catering license. Legitimate operation. Small, 6 employees. That's what she's doing here tonight. She's staff, not a guest." Luca looked at the sheet. Something in the mobility pattern, the regular intervals, the northeast corridor, never too far but never settling, resolved itself into a shape he recognized. Not instability. Pattern. Practiced pattern. "She's been moving on purpose," he said. "Looks like." "From what?" Marco was quiet for a moment. "That's the part I don't have yet." Luca folded the sheet. "Get it." He paused at the suite door. "And Marco, what you saw tonight. The boy." "I didn't see anything," Marco said immediately. "Good." Luca went inside. He sat in the chair by the window for a long time. The suite was warm and the snow was still falling and the city below was doing what the city did. It never actually went quiet, not even on Christmas Eve, not even under 2 inches of new snow. His father's pendant, on the boy's neck, his eyes in the boy's face. He had given Elena that pendant the night he decided she was his future, and 3 weeks later she had walked away without a word. No letter, no call, no explanation. Nothing. He had looked for her, not casually, not with the resigned acceptance of a man processing romantic loss, but with the full resources of the Moretti organization operating on his behalf. She had not been found. Eventually, he had told himself a story about what that meant. She had chosen something else. Someone else. She had weighed what Luca was and what he came with, and she had made a rational decision and walked. He had hated her for it, methodically, over years, had built the hatred into something architectural, something that held up the structure of his days. And tonight, a 5-year-old with his eyes had asked him a question in a ballroom full of people, and the structure he'd spent 5 years building was standing on ground he wasn't sure he'd correctly mapped. He picked up his phone. He started with the date. 5 years, 3/4. He worked backward from Noah's apparent age to the window of probable conception. He placed that window against the last months of his relationship with Elena. The math was simple. The math led directly to a single, immovable point in time. He set the phone down. He went to the window and put his hand flat against the glass and felt the cold coming through it, and looked at the snow falling on Fifth Avenue and let himself, for the first time since the terrace, feel the full weight of what the evening had delivered. A son. He had a son, and Elena, who he had spent 5 years believing had left him by choice, who he had built a narrative of betrayal around, who he had used as the justification for everything he'd closed off in himself. Elena had spent 5 years alone with the boy, moving every 18 months, working under a business license instead of her own name, staying in the Northeast Corridor, which meant staying close to something she wouldn't let herself get too far from. Close to him. His mind, which was very good at threat assessment, began to reorganize everything it thought it knew. And the shape that was emerging from the reorganization was not the shape of a woman who had abandoned him. It was the shape of a woman who had been running. His phone buzzed. Marco. Found something. Not digital, had to go physical. There's a storage unit in Bridgeport registered to a shell company. Manager owes Sal a favor. Says a woman matching her description has been in twice in the last year. I don't know what's in there, but I can find out by morning. Luca typed back, do it. He set the phone on the windowsill. Outside, the snow was picking up. Harder now, the flakes coming in at a slight angle from the northeast, driven by a wind that had come down from somewhere colder. In his mind, the 5 years were reorganizing themselves. Every assumption he had calcified into certainty was loosening. He had been wrong. He did not know yet how wrong, or about what specifically, but the structure of his wrongness was becoming visible, and it was large. It was 5 years large. It was a child large, and somewhere in the Harrington Hotel on 46th Street, Elena Rossi was sitting in a room with his son, who had storm cloud gray eyes and his great-grandfather's pendant around his neck, and had asked a stranger in a ballroom why they looked the same. Luca stood at the window while the city moved below him in the snow, and the anger that had lived in his chest for 5 years began, slowly, to transform into something colder and more purposeful. Not the anger of betrayal, but the anger of a man who is beginning to understand that what he thought was abandonment may have been something done to both of them, by someone else entirely. He stayed at the window until past midnight. He did not sleep. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. And before it was over, he was going to know the truth. All of it. The call came at 6:43 in the morning. Luca hadn't slept. He'd been at the desk in the hotel suite since 2 a.m. with Marco's file spread across the surface. Printed pages, photographs, a timeline Marco had constructed by hand on legal paper because some information you didn't want traveling through digital channels. The suite's heating system ran too warm, and he'd taken off his jacket 3 hours ago and rolled his sleeves and worked through the night with the focused, lightless concentration of a man who has turned grief into methodology. By 6 a.m., he had a shape. Not a complete picture. There were gaps that needed filling, threads that needed pulling, but enough of a shape that the story he'd been telling himself for 5 years had begun to look like what it was, a story. Someone else's construction. A narrative built from engineered silence and placed over the truth like a false floor. Marco called at 6:43. The storage unit, Marco said without preamble. You need to see it. Tell me. I'd rather show you, but I'll tell you the headline. A pause, not for effect. Marco wasn't built for effect, but the pause of a man deciding how to deliver something he doesn't fully understand yet. She kept everything, Luca. Every letter, every phone record, every attempt she made to reach you. Another pause. There are 43 letters, dated and sealed, all addressed to you. None of them were ever sent. Luca was quiet. There are also phone records, Marco continued. Printed copies. She must have requested them from the carrier at some point. Calls made from her number to yours. 16 of them over a 3-week period. He stopped. All showing as connected. Duration ranging from 40 seconds to 2 minutes. That's not possible, Luca said. His voice was flat. I never received a call from her. Not one. I know. Someone answered those calls. Yes. Luca set down the pen he'd been holding. He looked at the timeline on Marco's legal paper. The 3-week period Marco was describing aligned precisely with the window he'd already identified. The weeks after the night he'd given her the pendant. The weeks before she disappeared. Someone who had my phone, Luca said. Marco was quiet in the specific way that meant he was letting Luca run the logic himself. Or someone who had a phone that routed through my number, Luca said. A redirect. He stood up from the desk. Who had access to my lines in that period? That's what I've been sitting here asking myself since 4 this morning, Marco said. The answer is a short list, and one of the names on it is making me very uncomfortable. Say it. Not on the phone, Marco said. I'm at the unit. Come see the letters first. Then we'll talk about the name. Luca was dressed and in the elevator in 4 minutes. The drive to Bridgeport took 50 minutes in the early Christmas morning quiet, the highway almost empty, the snow from the night before sitting white and undisturbed on the road shoulders and the bare tree lines. Luca sat in the back of the car and watched it go by and did not speak. His driver, a man named Costa, who had been with the family for 9 years, did not attempt conversation. Costa was good at reading the specific quality of Luca's silences. The storage facility was a low concrete complex off the industrial corridor, the kind of place that looked like it had been built without any expectation of being noticed. Marco was waiting outside Unit 44 with 2 of his men positioned at the facility entrance and another at the end of the corridor. Luca noted the positioning without comment. Marco had been careful. Good. The unit was 8 by 12 and it held, in addition to several sealed boxes and a locked metal filing cabinet, a life assembled in evidence. Elena had been meticulous in a way that Luca recognized, the same quality he applied to his own records, the instinct of someone who knows that documentation is armor. The letters were in a fireproof box, unlocked, 43 envelopes, his name on each one, in her handwriting, which he had not seen in 5 years, and which hit him somewhere low in the chest when he looked at it directly. He did not open them. Not yet. He set them down and picked up the phone records instead. The records were exactly as Marco had described. 16 calls over 22 days, each one showing a connection, a duration, a clean termination, from her number to his. 16 times she had believed she was speaking with someone on his end. 16 times someone had intercepted that call, managed it, and closed it. He set the records down with the same controlled deliberateness he used for everything and stood in the middle of the storage unit and breathed. The name, he said. Marco had positioned himself near the door. He pulled it half closed first, old habit, soundproofing the conversation. Then he said, Caruso. The name sat in the cold air of the unit, Dominic Caruso. Luca's late uncle's consigliere, a man who had served the Moretti organization for 30 years, who had been present at every significant structural decision of Luca's rise, who had managed communications infrastructure for the family during the period when Luca had been building the East Coast operation and had not yet fully professionalized the technical side. A man who had retired, apparently, 4 years ago to a house in Westchester and a boat he kept at a marina in Stamford. He had full access to my communication systems in that period, Luca said. Complete access, Marco said. He was running the line protocols himself. We hadn't shifted to the current system yet. He could have redirected incoming calls without leaving a clean trace in the infrastructure. And the outgoing letters? Mine to her? They would have gone through the courier system he managed. Marco's jaw moved. He could have intercepted incoming mail to her address as well. She would never have seen anything you sent. Luca thought about that for a moment. He thought about the letters in the fireproof box, 43 letters she had written and kept. He thought about his own letters, whatever he had written, and sent in that 3-week window before he'd been told, by Caruso, that Elena had been located in New York and had been seen with another man. A specific piece of information delivered with the practiced sympathy of a senior advisor delivering unwelcome news. Luca had not questioned it. He had not questioned it because Caruso was trusted infrastructure, because Luca had still been young enough in his position to believe that the men his uncle had built around him were walls rather than architecture that could be turned against him. Why? Luca said. It wasn't really a question. He was thinking aloud. My best guess, Marco said carefully, is the bloodline problem. He paused. Your uncle's faction, the old guard, they had a specific candidate for your future. You know this. Adriana Ferri. The Ferri family alliance would have consolidated the northern operation and given the Morettis a cleaner political position. Elena was never a threat to that. She would have been if she'd had your child. The words fell into the unit's cold quiet like something solid. Luca looked at Marco. If Caruso knew she was pregnant, Marco said, or suspected she might be, A woman with a Moretti child would have a claim on succession that the Ferry Alliance couldn't override. She would have been, in the framework those men operated in, a structural problem. The cleanest solution was separation. Make each of you believe the other walked. No confrontation, no evidence, no blood. He paused. It was elegant, actually, from a certain perspective. Don't, Luca said quietly. Marco stopped. Luca picked up the phone records again and looked at them without reading them. His hands were completely steady. That was the training, the 15 years of building a wall between interior state and exterior expression. Behind the wall, something was happening that had no clean name. It wasn't grief exactly, and it wasn't rage exactly, though rage was present. It was more like the specific disorientation of a man who has navigated for 5 years by a map that was drawn incorrectly from the beginning and has now been handed the real one. She was running from someone, Luca said, the movement pattern, every 18 months. If she suspected Caruso or whoever he was working with, she would have had reason to move. She had my son, and she was running. Yes. He set the phone records down. He looked at the letters in the fireproof box. 43. He thought about the count, not the romantic arithmetic of it, but the practical weight of it. How long you have to sit with something before you stop writing letters you can never send. How long before you put them in a box in a locked storage unit instead of destroying them. She had kept them. That was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. I need 2 things, Luca said. I need you to find out how much Caruso knew and who he was working with inside the organization. And I need you to find out what threat Elena has been running from specifically, whether it's connected to Caruso or whether there's a separate party who knows about Noah. Marco nodded. And Caruso himself? Luca looked at him steadily. Don't touch him yet. I want the full picture before anything moves. A pause. But watch him, closely and quietly. He drove back to Manhattan. I went to the Harrington on 46th Street and he stood at the front desk and asked for Elena Rossi's room and was told, by the front desk staff, that Miss Rossi had checked out. He stood at the front desk for a moment. The lobby was doing Christmas morning, a small decorated tree, instrumental music, a single family with young children crossing toward the elevator. He processed the information. She'd run. He pulled out his phone and called Marco. She's gone from the hotel. Run her car if she has one registered. Check the train station and the bus terminal. And check if her catering business has a vehicle. Already on it, Marco said. I anticipated. He was back in the car when Marco called with the address. A catering van, registered to the business, caught on a traffic camera on I-95 North 40 minutes ago, moving toward Connecticut, toward Bridgeport. He understood, in that moment, that she was going to the storage unit. She'd left the hotel, and she was going back to get what she had there, and she would know when she arrived and found it accessed, and Marco's presence still written in the small disturbances of the space, that Luca had already been there. Get there before she does, he told Costa. Fast. They arrived 7 minutes before the catering van pulled into the facility lot. Luca was standing in the corridor outside Unit 44 when Elena came around the corner carrying Noah on her hip. The boy still half asleep, head lolling slightly against her shoulder, wearing a coat over what appeared to be Christmas morning pajamas. And she stopped when she saw him. Noah stirred, looked up with the unfocused eyes of a child not yet fully awake. Saw Luca. Considered him with the brief, drowsy assessment of someone operating on partial processing capacity. Then apparently filed him under non-threatening and lowered his head back to his mother's shoulder. Elena's face did the sequence again. Recognition, fear, and then the controlled surface. But it moved faster this time, compressed by exhaustion. She hadn't slept either. It was visible in the skin under her eyes and in the set of her shoulders. You were here, she said. Flat. Not accusatory. She'd already done the math. Yes. She looked at the unit door, then back at him. The letters. I didn't read them. He paused. I will. Something moved through her face that was not quite relief and not quite grief. It was the expression of a woman who has been bracing for impact for a long time and has been delivered instead a reprieve she doesn't entirely trust yet. I need to put him down, she said. Her voice was low, careful not to wake Noah further. Is there somewhere? There's a break room at the end of the corridor, Luca said. He'd noted it on the way in. Couch, heated. She carried Noah down the corridor. Luca walked beside her. Neither spoke. The boy's breathing was slow and even against her shoulder. At the break room, she pushed the door open with her foot and settled Noah onto the vinyl couch with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has done this 10,000 times in exactly these circumstances, moving a sleeping child from one surface to another without losing the sleep. She pulled her coat off and draped it over him. She straightened and turned and looked at Luca, and there was nothing left on her face that was performing for anyone. She was just exhausted and afraid and standing in a storage facility break room on Christmas morning. "Caruso," Luca said. She went very still. "That's who you've been running from." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then something in her posture changed. A specific release, the physical expression of a decision made. "Not Caruso specifically," she said. "I didn't know the name until 2 years ago. I knew someone in your organization had intercepted our communications. I didn't know who." She paused. "2 years ago I found a name, Caruso. And I found something else." "Tell me." "He wasn't acting alone." She said it carefully. "And the person he was working with, the person who wanted Noah removed from the picture before anyone knew he existed, is still inside your organization." Luca's eyes didn't move. "Who?" "I don't have a name," she said. "I have a pattern. Payments, movement, decisions that don't make sense unless someone was feeding information outward." She turned toward the filing cabinet she'd clearly been coming to retrieve. "It's in there. Everything I've been able to document." She looked back at him. "That's why I kept moving. Every time I got close to stable, something would shift. I'd see a car I recognized, or I'd notice someone asking questions about the catering business that were the wrong kind of questions. I couldn't prove it, but I could feel it." "Why didn't you come to me?" "Not quite a question, not quite an accusation, something in between." She looked at him with the expression of a woman deciding whether the person in front of her deserves the actual answer. Then she gave it to him. "Because I didn't know who around you was clean. I didn't know if the person who'd orchestrated the separation had also built a wall between you and information that might reach you. And because—" She stopped, looked at the boy sleeping on the couch, looked back at Luca. "Because if I'd been wrong about who to trust, Noah would have paid for it." He stood there with that. "I made a calculation," she said, quieter. "Every day for 5 years. I calculated the risk of reaching you against the risk of what would happen if I reached the wrong person instead. And every day the calculation came out the same." A pause. "I'm sorry that it cost you what it cost you. I need you to know I know what it cost you." He was quiet for a long time. The heating unit in the break room made a low mechanical sound. Outside the small window at the top of the wall, the morning was gray and white. "There's a leak inside my organization," he said finally. "Active, not historical." "Yes." "And someone connected to that leak knows Noah exists." She looked at him. Her jaw tightened once. "I think so. After last night—" She stopped. "Last night was a mistake. I should have pulled Noah out before the gala. He was supposed to stay in the back of house with 2 of my employees, but he slipped away. You know how he is." She caught herself. "You know how he is." As if he knew anything, as if he'd had 5 years of learning who this child was. Her expression shifted, a small fracture. "He wandered. He found you." "He found me," Luca said. "After last night, anyone in that room who was looking for a connection—" She paused. "There were 500 people there, Luca. If your leak has eyes in that room, then they know," Luca said. She nodded. He turned and pulled out his phone and called Marco. "I need you to run a threat assessment on last night's guest list. Anyone with a connection to the Tsella family or the Northern Independent Operators. Cross-reference against the patterns in the documentation Elena Rossi has been building." He listened for a moment. "Yes, right now. And put 2 men on the Harrington and 2 on the catering facility in Bridgeport." He paused. "And Marco, no one outside our immediate circle knows about the boy. That's a hard line." He ended the call, turned back to Elena. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something layered, something that had too many years of separate experience in it for him to parse quickly. "You believe me," she said, slightly surprised, as if she hadn't entirely expected to get this far. "I was at that storage unit at 4 this morning," he said. "I've seen the records. I know what a redirected call looks like in the documentation. He paused. I also know what 43 unsent letters mean. She looked away. Her jaw worked once. She was not going to cry in front of him. He could see the specific quality of the effort it took, and he respected it without saying so. On the couch, Noah made a small sound and shifted, pulling her coat tighter around himself without waking. They both looked at him for a moment. Luca looked at the boy's face. The gray eyes were closed. The dark hair was pushed sideways in sleep. The pendant was just visible at the collar of his pajama top, the small silver chain catching the light from the overhead bulb. He looked at his son's face for a long time, without the noise of the ballroom around him, without 500 witnesses, without Vanessa at his shoulder and Marco at his back, and the performed architecture of the gala pressing on every available surface. Just a man standing in a plain room looking at a child who had his eyes and his great-grandfather's pendant and who had fallen asleep in a stranger's coat on a vinyl couch, completely unaware of the geography of danger that surrounded him. Something in Luca's chest moved in a way that had nothing to do with calculation or strategy, a way that preceded all of his trained responses and was faster than any wall he'd built. He turned away from it, filed it, set it somewhere to be handled when the immediate threat matrix was resolved. He can't go back to Bridgeport, Luca said. Not until I know the scope of the exposure. I know. I have a property in Westchester, secure. My people there are inner circle. They've been with the family since before my time. He looked at her steadily. You'll both come there. She was quiet. He watched her run the calculation, the same one she'd been running for 5 years, the same ledger of risk and trust, and the specific unknowns that came with relying on him. He waited while she ran it. Okay, she said. They were at the door of the break room when his phone buzzed. He looked at it. Marco. A text, not a call, which meant the information was urgent, but Marco didn't want it spoken aloud. Sella family sent 3 men to the Harrington at 7:10 this morning. Elena's room. Staff confirmed she'd already checked out. They're asking questions about a woman with a child. Luca read it twice, felt the threat matrix restructure itself around the new information with the speed that came from years of doing exactly this kind of restructuring. 3 men. The Sella family. The Harrington. 40 minutes after Elena had checked out. They hadn't been watching the gala randomly. They'd been watching Luca, and they'd seen exactly what they needed to see. A 5-year-old boy with storm cloud gray eyes asking the wrong question to the wrong man, and a woman in a dark green dress taking the boy away with the specific controlled speed of someone trying not to run. They knew about Noah, and they'd moved on it before dawn. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at Elena. She read his face. She'd always been able to read his face, even when no one else could. And her own face went the specific pale of someone receiving news their body has already processed before their mind catches up. We need to move, he said. Right now. She turned back to the couch and lifted Noah in one motion, the boy coming awake partially and making a low sound of complaint before settling against her shoulder with the resigned flexibility of a child accustomed to being moved without warning. She held him with one arm and reached for the filing cabinet keys in her pocket. Leave it, Luca said. Marco will secure it. I need Elena. He said her name with the full weight of the present moment behind it. The people who were supposed to be in your hotel room 40 minutes ago are not people who leave a conversation unfinished. We are leaving now. She looked at him. She looked at Noah. She left the filing cabinet. They moved down the corridor toward the exit, Luca's hand already on his phone calling Costa to bring the car to the side entrance, his other hand moving to the small of his back where the weight he always carried was exactly where he'd left it. Marco's men fell in at the corridor entrance without being told. Noah lifted his head from his mother's shoulder and looked at Luca with the half-awake, fully present curiosity that was apparently his baseline mode of engaging with the world. Where are we going? He asked. His voice was rough with sleep. Luca looked at the boy, at his own eyes in the boy's face, at the pendant at his collar. Somewhere safe, Luca said. Noah considered this with the gravity of someone receiving logistical information. Then, is it far? Not far. Okay. He settled his head back against Elena's shoulder and closed his eyes with the simple, devastating trust of a child who has decided the answer is sufficient. Luca pushed open the exit door into the cold, white morning. Somewhere behind them, in a hotel room on 46th Street, Three men from the Sella family were asking questions that confirmed what Luca already knew. The people who had engineered 5 years of separation had not finished their work yet, and the 5-year-old boy sleeping against his mother's shoulder, completely unaware that his existence had already been noted by men who dealt in the currency of threats and elimination. That boy had just become the single most dangerous variable in the most dangerous game Luca Moretti had ever played. And Luca hadn't even learned his son's favorite color yet. The Westchester property sat behind 2 gates and a quarter-mile of private road, surrounded by old oak trees that in summer formed a canopy dense enough to block satellite imaging. In winter they stood bare and dark against the gray sky, their branches holding snow in narrow lines like something written in a language Luca had never learned to read. He'd bought the property 7 years ago for exactly what it was being used for now, a place that didn't exist on any organizational chart, that his enemies couldn't map because he'd never brought anyone there who talked. Costa brought the car through the second gate at 9:41 in the morning, Christmas Day. The road was unplowed and the tires moved through 6 inches of fresh snow with a low compressed sound. In the back seat, Noah had fallen fully asleep again, his weight pressing against Elena's side, her arm locked around him in the unconscious grip of a woman who had been holding on for 5 years and didn't know how to stop. Luca sat on the other side of the car. He watched the property materialize through the windshield and ran the threat assessment for the 4th time since leaving Bridgeport and came to the same conclusions. The exposure was real, the timeline was compressed, and the variable he could not yet quantify was the identity of the internal source, the person inside his organization who had been feeding information to the Tella family. Caruso was the instrument, but instruments had handlers. The house was stone and timber, 3 stories, built in the 30s by someone who had understood that security and domesticity were not mutually exclusive. His caretaker, a retired man named Byrne, who had been with the Moretti family since Luca's father's time, met them at the front door with the specific composure of a man who has learned not to register surprise at anything that arrives through those gates. Luca carried Noah inside. The boy was deeply asleep, and the transfer from Elena's arms to Luca's happened in the driveway in a single awkward moment when it became clear that Elena needed both hands to gather the things from the car, and Luca simply reached and took the child before either of them had fully decided it was happening. Noah transferred without waking, settling against Luca's shoulder with the complete physical trust of someone operating below the level of conscious decision-making. Luca carried his son through the front door of the Westchester house and felt the weight of him, actual, physical, specific, and did not let anything show on his face while something enormous moved through his chest and found no exit. He put Noah on the couch in the front room, arranged the cushions the way he'd watched Elena do it, and stepped back. Byrne had coffee going. Elena stood in the doorway of the front room with her arms crossed and watched Luca with an expression he couldn't decode, something that had gratitude in it and pain in it, and the specific complexity of a woman watching a man she once knew completely do something she has been imagining in partial, painful fragments for 5 years. "I need the room," Luca told Byrne. Byrne nodded and moved. He was good at that. Luca turned to Elena. "Sit down." "I'm not—" "Elena, sit down. We have approximately 2 hours before I need to move on the Caruso situation. And before I do that, I need everything you have. All of it. The documentation, the names, the patterns. Everything you've been building for 5 years. We do this now." She sat. They went through it for 90 minutes. She had organized it the way a careful person organizes evidence, chronologically first, then by category, then cross-referenced by name. The documentation she'd been building was more complete than he'd expected. Phone records, financial traces, a series of property transactions that connected shell companies across 3 states. She'd done this work alone, with the resources of a small catering business and the methodical patience of a woman who had decided that documentation was the only form of protection she could afford. 2 names emerged from the cross-referencing that he didn't have from Marco's work. The first was a man named Trent Savio, mid-level Moretti operator, logistics, had been with the organization for 6 years. The financial trace put him in contact with a Sella family intermediary through a property transaction in Newark dated 14 months ago. The second name stopped Luca's hand on the table. He looked at the document. He read the name twice. He set it down. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was completely level. Elena looked at him carefully. "A wire transfer record. It took me 8 months to trace the shell company back to the source. I had a forensic accountant in Boston, someone who doesn't ask questions, do the final layer of work. She paused. I know what that name means to you. He picked the document back up. The name at the bottom of the transfer chain was not Caruso. It was not Savio. It was not any Sella family affiliate. It was Dominic Ferrante, Luca's head of personal security, the man who had been at his right shoulder for 4 years, who had vetted every location Luca visited, who managed the physical architecture of Luca's daily protection, who had, by the nature of his role, access to Luca's complete movement schedule, his communication infrastructure, his inner circle's identity and location, who had been at the gala last night, who had seen Noah. Luca set the document down with the same controlled precision he used for everything. His hands did not shake, his face did not move. Behind the wall, something was happening that he did not have a name for, something that was fury and betrayal, and the specific cold horror of realizing that the person responsible for your physical safety has been the most dangerous person in the room for 4 years. Does Marco know this name? He asked. No, she said. I only ever showed this to the accountant in Boston, and he doesn't know what it means. Luca pulled out his phone. He stopped. He looked at the phone. He thought about Ferrante's access to his communication infrastructure. He thought about every call he'd made to Marco in the last 12 hours. He put the phone back in his pocket. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was still. The oak trees stood in their rows. Somewhere out on the road, his property line was being watched by men he'd assigned this morning, men whose assignments had been communicated through channels that Ferrante had access to. He turned back to Elena. I need to use Burns' landline. He used it to reach Marco through an intermediary, a layer of distance that felt inadequate but was better than nothing. I gave Marco the name in 3 words and heard the silence on the other end of the line that told him Marco was running the same calculations and arriving at the same horrifying conclusions. How long do you need? Luca asked. 2 hours? Marco said. Maybe less. The financial trace you're describing. If the documentation is solid, I can verify the key transaction through our own records. I have access to the Zurich accounts from the same period. Do it. And Marco, assume that everything communicated through standard channels in the last 24 hours is potentially compromised. Another silence. Understood. He hung up and turned back to the room. Elena was watching him from the chair with Noah still asleep on the couch behind her. The boy had shifted in his sleep and one arm was hanging off the cushion edge. Luca crossed the room and lifted the arm back onto the cushion. He did it without thinking, stood back up and found Elena looking at him with an expression that was beyond his ability to categorize. He went to the kitchen and stood at the window over the sink and drank a cup of Burns' terrible coffee and waited. The call came in 47 minutes, not 2 hours. Marco's voice when he spoke had a quality Luca had heard from him precisely twice before in 11 years. A controlled compression that meant the information was bad enough that Marco was actively managing his own reaction while delivering it. The transaction verifies, Marco said. Clean chain, Ferrante to the shell to a Sella family account in Atlantic City. A pause. There's more. I pulled his movement records from our internal system, his logged locations for the last 6 months. He's been meeting an unregistered contact in Hoboken on a regular interval, every 3 to 4 weeks. I have no record of who the contact is. When was the last meeting? 4 days ago. 4 days before the gala, before Noah appeared in that ballroom. Luca processed this in silence. There's something else, Marco said. His voice went quieter. His movement log for this morning shows him departing a location in Westchester at 7:30 a.m. Luca went still. Which location? He said. Marco gave him the address. It was 2 miles from where Luca was standing. He set down the coffee cup. He knows where the property is. He would, Marco said. He's run security sweeps here. 2 years ago, before the meeting with the Philly. He knows I'm here, Luca said. He knew before I arrived. He was already moving back toward the front room, his hand going to his back. How many men do I have on the perimeter? 4. But Luca, Marco stopped. If Ferrante briefed the Sella people on your location and movement this morning, 4 men on the perimeter is not... The sound reached him before Marco finished the sentence. Not loud. A professional operation doesn't announce itself. It was the sound of the side gate mechanism, a specific metallic register that Luca had memorized years ago because he made it a practice to memorize the sounds of every space he used as a refuge. It was the sound of the gate being opened from the outside by someone who had the code. Luca said, "Marco, now," and dropped the landline receiver without hanging it up. He moved through the kitchen doorway into the front room in 4 steps. Elena saw his face and was on her feet before he said a word. He pointed at Noah, then at the hallway, then held up 2 fingers. "Move him, 2nd floor." She understood immediately. The same quality of comprehension that had always existed between them, before everything. The ability to communicate in economy because the other person was already halfway to the same conclusion. She lifted Noah from the couch. The boy woke partially, confused, beginning to ask something. Elena said, "Shh, baby, we're just moving," in the quiet, certain voice that a child trusts completely, and he settled. Luca pointed up. She moved to the stairs. Byrne appeared from the back corridor. Luca held up one hand, "Stay," and pointed to the kitchen. Byrne moved without question. Luca positioned himself at the side window of the front room, standing at the wall edge so he was not visible through the glass. He looked through the gap between the curtain edge and the frame. 3 men coming up the drive from the side gate, moving in the spread formation of professionals. Not a straight line, not clustered. Their coats were dark, and their hands were visible at their sides, which meant they were carrying under the coats. Moving at a pace that was purposeful, but not running. The pace of men who believe they have the element of surprise and are not wasting it. 3 visible, which meant there were more he couldn't see. He heard the creak of the 2nd step on the staircase, Elena's weight on the way up. And then the floor above him received her and the sound of Noah's voice, low and confused, and then quiet. He moved to the front door and positioned himself against the wall beside it. Breathing, slow. The training worked in moments like this the way it worked in the gala. The body following grooves cut over years, the mind running clear because there was no capacity left for anything that wasn't the immediate geometry of survival. The front door handle moved. They had the code for the gate. Did they have the door? They tried it and it didn't open. 1 second, 2. Then the sound of the window to his left. The sitting room window, glass pressure, someone testing the frame from outside. Luca moved back through the front room and into the short corridor that connected to the sitting room, keeping to the wall, staying off the sight lines from the windows. He heard Byrne moving somewhere in the back of the house with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has spent a long career understanding when to be invisible. The sitting room window came in with a sharp, controlled crack. Not broken glass, but the frame lock failing under specific applied pressure. Someone who knew what they were doing. The window swung open. Cold air flooded the room. A man came through it. He was on the floor and the situation was resolved before it could escalate into sound, which was the goal. Luca didn't allow himself to register the specifics. His body had done what it had been trained to do. He checked the man, found a phone with an active call connected, killed the call, and took the man's weapon. 1 phone call meant communication. The others knew. He heard the front door. The mechanism this time, not a test. Someone working the lock with a tool. He moved back to the corridor. The door came open and the second man was through it before Luca had fully repositioned. What followed was not a choreographed exchange. It was fast and ugly and entirely without the clean efficiency of the movies. Furniture involved, a lamp, the specific chaos of a confined space with 2 large men and the fundamental physics of violence, which is almost always louder and slower and more damaging to both parties than any plan anticipates. Luca ended up against the wall with his forearm across the man's throat and his knee on the floor and blood from somewhere, his own, from the corner of the doorframe, dripping onto the hardwood. He stayed there for a moment after, breathing. Let the body report its inventory. Left shoulder. Something had impacted it wrong, functional but unhappy. Knee. The floor. 2 parallel lines of pain across his left forearm from fingernails, which he registered as faintly absurd. The blood from his head was minimal, and the world remained fully focused, which meant nothing structural. He got up. He cleared the ground floor in 40 seconds. Found Byrne in the back pantry with a 12-gauge Luca hadn't known he kept there, and a composure that Luca found, briefly, admirable. 2 more outside, Byrne said. East and west perimeter. Your men have them. Luca went upstairs. Elena was at the end of the upper hallway, in the doorway of the room he'd pointed her toward. Noah pressed behind her. her body making itself into whatever wall was available. When she heard Luca's footsteps, she looked up with the specific expression of a woman running on pure biological alarm, and then something in it shifted when she saw him. Relief hitting the surface and then immediately complicated by the state of his face, which he'd forgotten was currently providing evidence of the last 4 minutes. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's minor." "You're—" "Elena." He looked past her at Noah. The boy was awake and pressed against the wall behind his mother with his knees up, his face doing something that was trying very hard to be brave. 5 years old. 5 3/4. His eyes were tracking everything. The blood on Luca's face, the weapon in Luca's hand, the set of his mother's posture, with the frightened processing attention of a child absorbing something his framework isn't big enough to hold yet. Luca crouched down, put the weapon behind him, out of Noah's sightline, in the waistband at his back, looked at the boy directly. "You okay?" he asked. Noah looked at him for a moment. His chin was doing something. He put his teeth into his lower lip and made it stop. "I heard loud things," he said. "I know. Mom said don't come out." "Your mom was right." He held the boy's gaze, his own eyes in the boy's face, watching him with a concentration that was trying to decode what kind of moment this was. "It's over now. You hear me? It's done." Noah's chin moved again. He pushed his teeth into his lip again. Nodded once. The nod of someone taking the information on provisional trust because the alternative is too large to hold. Luca stood up. He looked at Elena. She was watching him with an expression that had too many things in it to untangle quickly. The fear coming down, the specific wreckage of the last 20 minutes, and something else. Something that was looking at the way he'd just spoken to her son and filing it somewhere it would have consequences later. His phone buzzed. Marco, on the number he'd called from the car. Apparently Marco had made the decision to try every number he had. He answered. 3 men at the perimeter, Marco said immediately. Your guys have 2 of them. 1 got through the west gate. Is the house handled, Luca said. But Marco, listen to me. Ferrante is not picking up his phone, and his last logged position puts him 2 miles from this property as of 90 minutes ago. Find him. Already trying, Marco said. There's something else. His voice changed. I just had a call from Sal. Ferrante reached out to the organization, not through standard channel, directly to 3 of the senior lieutenants, and told them that you've gone off protocol, that you've compromised the organization by bringing an unauthorized civilian contact into a secured property, that the Sela situation is a result of your judgment failure. A pause. He's framing this as a competence problem. He's trying to move the lieutenants while you're off-site and occupied. Luca stood in the upper hallway of his Westchester property with his son 10 feet away and blood drying on the left side of his face and the structural reality of a coup. Attempt being executed against him in real time while he stood here unable to be in 2 places. Which lieutenants, he said. Marco gave him 3 names. 2 were predictable. Men who'd been with the organization long enough to have loyalty to position over person, men who would weigh a competence argument if it came from a credible source with enough supporting evidence. The 3rd name was not predictable. It was a man Luca had brought up himself, had trusted with mid-level authority, and been planning to elevate. That one landed differently. He's been working on them for months, Luca said. It wasn't a question. The prep work was too clean to be opportunistic. Ferrante had been building this scenario, waiting for a moment when Luca was off-site, occupied, compromised by a personal situation, and had constructed the pieces in advance. Looks like, Marco said. Can you hold them? For now. But Luca, if you're not in the room within a few hours, I know. He thought with the specific compressed speed of a man who has too many problems and a small window. Call Sal. Tell him I need a sit-down, all 3 lieutenants, tonight. Tell him it's direct from me. He paused. And tell him what we have on Ferrante. All of it. Let the evidence run ahead of me. And Ferrante himself? Find him first, Luca said. Don't move on him until I tell you. I want him in a room. He ended the call. Stood in the hallway. Elena was watching him. How bad? She said. Not a question. She'd heard enough of one side of the call to construct the shape of it. He looked at her. He made a decision about how much truth to give her and then gave her all of it, because she had spent 5 years making decisions with incomplete information, and he was not going to do that to her. Ferrante, the man whose financial records you traced, is inside my organization making a move while I'm here. He's trying to peel off my senior people. He paused. He knew this morning would compromise me. He may have arranged this morning specifically to compromise me. Elena went through something in her face. It moved fast and settled into something cold and clear. He needed you out of the building. Yes. He orchestrated the Sela attack knowing you'd survive it, because you survive things, but knowing it would force you off-site, off-protocol, dealing with a personal situation that makes you look weak to your people. She said it with the flat clarity of someone who has spent 5 years learning to think like the people who were hunting her. He used Noah. Luca looked at her. He knew about Noah, she said. He's known long enough to build this into a plan. That means... She stopped. Something moved through her expression, the specific horror of a calculation arriving at a destination she hadn't intended. He didn't just know about Noah from last night. He's known for longer. Luca's mind went back to the movement logs. The meetings in Hoboken every 3 to 4 weeks. How long had Ferrante been feeding information to the Cella family? How long had the Cella family known that Elena Rossi was in the Northeast Corridor with a child who carried Moretti blood? How many of Elena's close calls, the car she thought she recognized, the wrong questions about the catering business, had not been accidents or paranoia, but the deliberate, patient work of someone marking her location every 18 months and deciding each time that the moment hadn't yet arrived to act. Until last night. Until Noah walked across a ballroom floor and sat the moment into place with the innocent precision of a 5-year-old who hadn't been taught yet that some doors shouldn't be opened. They've been tracking you, Luca said. His voice came out very quiet. Not just recently, for years. Ferrante was keeping you accessible, keeping Noah as leverage. He stopped. Let it complete. He was saving you. Elena stared at him. Not out of mercy, Luca said, as an asset, as the thing he could use when the right moment came to move against the organization. A Moretti heir and the woman who raised him, alive and locatable. He looked at her. You weren't in danger from him. You were in storage. The silence in the hallway had a specific weight. From down the hall, Noah's voice. Mom? Small, uncertain, reaching. Elena turned, called back. I'm here, baby. Give me 1 more minute. Her voice was completely steady. He didn't know how she did that. She turned back to Luca. Her face was the face of a woman arriving at the bottom of something she has been falling toward for a long time. Not defeated, but stripped of every remaining illusion. What do we do? She said. Luca looked at her. He looked at the door at the end of the hall where his son was waiting in a room that was supposed to be safe and had proven, within 3 hours, to be already mapped by the man who managed Luca's personal security. He thought about the 3 lieutenants being worked by Ferrante. He thought about the Sela family and the dead men on his ground floor and the gate code that Ferrante had given to people who wanted his son. He had built an empire by understanding one thing clearly. The moment you start defending on all fronts simultaneously is the moment you've already lost. You choose your point of attack and you move everything you have toward it, and you accept the cost of the flanks. He had one point of attack. Everything else was noise. We end it tonight, he said. All of it. He started toward the stairs. He stopped with one hand on the rail. He looked back at Elena. When this is over, he said, I'm going to read those letters. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved, something that had been held under pressure for 5 years, finding the first available fracture. Okay, she said quietly. He went downstairs to begin the last night of the war that someone else had started, inside a house that was supposed to be the one place they couldn't reach, while his son waited at the end of a hallway and the snow came down over Westchester in the long, cold silence of Christmas afternoon. He made 6 calls from Burns' landline in the next 20 minutes, and each one was a surgical strike into the architecture of the problem. The first was to Sal, not to relay a message, but to speak directly, to put his voice on the line with the weight behind it, that 11 years of building this organization had given his voice, and to say, hold the room. The second was to a man named Ricci, who ran the financial side of the northern operation, and who owed Luca a debt of the kind that doesn't get repaid in money. The third was to an attorney in Manhattan who operated in the space between legitimate law and the kind of arrangements that never appeared in court filings, and who could, if asked, verify the financial documentation Elena had assembled in a form that would be legible to men who thought in terms of evidence and consequence. The fourth, fifth, and sixth were logistics, movement, vehicles, the specific coordination of getting 4 people out of a compromised property and into a position of operational advantage before nightfall. He gave himself 20 minutes to make the calls. Then he went upstairs. Noah was sitting on the edge of the bed in the room at the end of the hall, fully awake now, wearing his Christmas morning pajamas and his good leather shoes with one of them still unlaced, the pendant visible at his collar. He had found, somewhere in the room, a deck of cards, Burns probably, left in a drawer, and was doing something with them that wasn't quite shuffling, more a meditative handling, cards moving through his fingers with the restless energy of a child who has been told to stay in a room and has maximized the available entertainment. Elena was at the window. She turned when Luca came in. "We move in 40 minutes, Luca said. He looked at Noah. "You doing all right?" Noah looked up from the cards. He had a quality, Luca was building a vocabulary for it in real time, of considering questions fully before answering, a pause that was not hesitation but assessment. "Is it like this a lot?" he asked. "No," Luca said. "Mom's hands are shaking," Noah said. "Observational, not accusatory." Elena looked at her hands. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "I'm fine," she said. "You always say that," Noah told her with the fond, slightly weary accuracy of a child who has heard a specific phrase deployed in specific circumstances too many times to believe it anymore. Luca looked at the boy. He looked at Elena. He turned back to Noah and crouched to eye level, because he had learned in the last 12 hours that this was the register that worked. "Noah, in about 40 minutes I'm going to need you to get in a car with your mom and go somewhere. It won't be scary. The person driving you is named Costa, and he's been driving me for 9 years without once getting into an accident." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere in the city, a building I own. It has a room with a kitchen and a television, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know exactly what food is there, but I'll call ahead." Noah considered this. "Can I bring the cards?" "They're not mine to give you, but Byrne won't miss them." Noah pocketed the cards with the decisive efficiency of someone closing a transaction. He looked up. "Are you coming?" Luca looked at him steadily. "Not right away. I have to do something first, but I'll be there." "Promise?" The word hit him somewhere undefended. He absorbed it. "Yes," he said. He stood up. He caught Elena's eyes over the boy's head. She was watching him with the expression of a woman who has learned to keep hope at a specific controlled distance and is finding the distance harder to maintain than usual. They went downstairs. Byrne had the kitchen organized. The ground floor cleared, the 2 men Luca's perimeter team had taken off the property now handled. The property was clean in the operational sense. It would not remain undetected for long. That was the nature of the timeline. Costa arrived in the second car at the 40-minute mark. Luca put Elena and Noah into the back, watched Costa pull out through the main gate, stood in the cold driveway until the taillights disappeared around the first curve of the private road. Then he got in the other car with Marco, who had arrived in the last 10 minutes with 2 men and the compressed, forward-leaning posture of someone who has been running on information overload and adrenaline and has settled into the particular stillness that exists on the other side of all that. The stillness of readiness. "Ferrante," Luca said. "We have him," Marco said. "He's at the Meridian Club in Midtown. Arrived 40 minutes ago. Private dining room. He has 3 men with him, and he's been on the phone for the last hour." Marco paused. "The 3 lieutenants are there. He called the meeting himself." Luca processed this. Ferrante had moved the timeline up. He'd expected the Westchester operation to buy him more time, had perhaps expected Luca not to walk out of it cleanly, or to walk out of it too damaged to respond quickly. He'd called the lieutenants to a meeting because he was consolidating while he believed Luca was still dealing with the wreckage. "He doesn't know I'm mobile," Luca said. "Not yet." "How long before he does?" Marco looked at his watch. "His people at the property would have checked in by now. When they don't, he'll start to recalculate." He paused. 20 minutes, maybe less. "Then we have 20 minutes to be in that room before he knows we're coming." Marco looked at him, at the state of his face, which had been cleaned but still showed the evidence of the morning. At the set of his jaw and the quality of the stillness that had settled into Luca's posture in the driveway, which Marco had seen before and which he respected and privately found somewhat frightening. "How do you want to do this?" "Clean," Luca said. "I want it clean. I want him in the room with those three men, and I want to walk in and I want to let the evidence do the work. This doesn't end with a body at the Meridian Club." He paused. "It ends with Ferrante understanding what he's facing and making a choice. And then it ends with the choice having consequences." "And if he doesn't cooperate?" Luca looked out through the windshield at the Westchester Road, the trees going by in the gray afternoon light. "Then it ends differently," he said. The Meridian Club was old Manhattan money wearing a dark suit, mahogany panels, leather, the kind of lighting that cost a great deal to make appear effortless. It had operated for 60 years as a place where men of a certain kind of influence conducted the conversations that didn't belong in offices. Luca had been a member for 7 years. He knew the layout, the staff, the specific architecture of the private dining rooms on the second floor. He and Marco and 2 men went through the front entrance at 3:47 in the afternoon. The maitre d' recognized Luca and had the intelligence to keep his expression entirely neutral when Luca said, "Mr. Ferrante's room," and moved toward the stairs without waiting for confirmation. The room was at the end of the second-floor corridor. Dark wood door, closed. He could hear voices behind it. Not the words, the register. Multiple men, the low, serious cadence of a conversation that believes itself private. Luca opened the door and walked in. The room had a long table. Ferrante was at the head, which told Luca something about how the man had been running this meeting. The 3 lieutenants, Diaries, Montano, and the younger one, Piero, whose name in Marco's earlier list had landed wrong, were distributed along the sides. 3 additional men against the back wall, Ferrante's, who came off the wall when Luca entered, and then stopped when they registered Marco and the 2 behind him filling the doorway. A freeze. 6 seconds of absolute physical stillness in which everyone in the room ran their own version of the calculation. Ferrante was 53, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had always read as forthright. Open features, direct eyes, the specific affect of a man who had built a career on appearing to be exactly what he said he was. He looked at Luca across the table, and Luca watched the calculation run behind those direct eyes. Running the Westchester numbers, running the timeline, arriving at conclusions. Something shifted in Ferrante's face. Not fear, not yet. Something more controlled. A recalibration. "Luca," he said, even voice. "I know what you were doing," Luca said. He came to the table. He did not sit. He put the documentation Elena had assembled, the transfer records, the financial trace, the shell company chain, on the table in front of the 3 lieutenants and left it there. "Read it," he said to Grace, who was nearest. "All 3 of you. Read it before anyone says anything else." Ferrante's jaw moved once. "That documentation, Dominic." Luca said his name with the particular weight of a man who has decided that this is the last time he will use it with any quality of address in it whatsoever. "Stop talking." Gerace picked up the first page. He read. He passed it to Montano. Montano read. The process took 3 minutes and 30 seconds of silence in which no one moved and the only sound was paper. Piero was the last to hold it. He read it and set it down and did not look at Ferrante, and did not look at Luca, and looked instead at the table, which told Luca something about Piero's conscience that was somewhat useful. "The account in Atlantic City," Gerace said. He was 60, had been with the Moretti organization since Luca's father, and had the specific quality of a man who processes betrayal as information rather than emotion, because he has lived long enough to be unsurprised by it. He looked at Ferrante. "That's a Sella account." Ferrante said nothing. "You've been feeding the Sella family our operational structure," Gerace said. "Movement, communications, personnel." He paused. "For how long?" "The documentation covers 14 months, Marco said from the door. "We believe the actual relationship is longer." Ferrante looked at Luca. He had abandoned the recalibration and settled into something harder, the affect of a man who has been cornered and is assessing the geometry of the corner. "What happened at the property this morning?" he said. "I didn't order. 3 Cellamen came through a gate using a code that 6 people in this organization have access to," Luca said. You're one of the six. That doesn't... You were 2 miles from the property at 7:30 this morning, Lucas said. Your own movement log. He let that sit. You briefed them. You gave them the code and the layout and the timing. You told them I'd be there with a woman and a child and that the window was narrow. His voice was even. Behind the evenness, something was pulling tight. You put my son in a room with Sela soldiers. The word, son, landed in the room. The 3 lieutenants absorbed it. Gerace looked at Luca with an expression that was running a second set of calculations now. Montano's face did something that might have been surprise. Piero continued looking at the table. Ferrante's jaw moved. He looked at Luca, and for the first time something genuine surfaced in his expression. Not remorse, not quite. Something more complex. You were never supposed to know about the boy, he said. That was the arrangement. She stayed alive, he stayed safe, and the situation remained contained. Nobody had to... The sentence ended because Luca's hand was on the table and he was leaning forward, and the quality of stillness that came off him in that moment was the kind that precedes complete structural failure. Not violence, not yet, but the absolute frontier of it, the place just before the wall comes down. Say that again, Luca said very quietly. Stayed alive. Ferrante heard something in the 2 words and stopped. You kept her alive, Luca said, as a decision, as a choice you made. Each sentence arrived separate, with space around it. You had the ability to harm them, and you chose not to, and you are presenting this to me as a form of mercy. The room was absolutely silent. Where's Caruso? Luca said. Retired, Ferrante said. Westchester. He's been... Caruso works for you, Luca said. Has worked for you since before I gave you the head of security position. He ran the communications intercept 5 years ago on your instruction. You gave him access to my lines, you gave him Elena's address, and you directed the separation. He straightened. The Ferry Alliance was worth enough to you that you dismantled my life to protect it. Ferrante looked at him. Something in his expression was working. The moral arithmetic of a man who has made a decision years ago and has been paying for it in the daily compound interest of maintenance and concealment, and who is now in the room where the balance comes due. The organization needed the Ferry connection, he said. Your uncle agreed. Before he died, he agreed. The Rossi woman would have... Her name, Luca said, is Elena. Silence. And she spent 5 years moving every 18 months to stay ahead of you while she raised my son alone. He stepped back from the table. He looked at the 3 lieutenants. The documentation on the table is going to the attorney Benedetti for formal verification. It will be available to every family affiliate by tomorrow morning. He looked at Gerace. I want Caruso brought in tonight, quietly. He doesn't know this meeting is happening. Gerace nodded without hesitation. Montano, Luca said. The Sela family representatives we have from this morning's operation. I want them in a room, not harmed. I want them in a room with a clear picture of what their family just attempted against a Moretti heir and what the Moretti organization's response is going to be. Montano nodded. He looked at Piero last. Piero, who had been studying the table for 4 minutes. Piero, who was 36 and had been given opportunity and had apparently been having a different conversation about loyalty for some portion of the preceding months. Piero looked up when Luca's silence demanded it. His face was doing something uncomfortable. You knew, Luca said. Not a question. Piero's jaw worked. I knew Ferrante had been talking to outside parties. I didn't know the scope. He stopped. I should have come to you. Yes, Luca said. You should have. A silence in which Piero's future in the organization was weighed against his partial culpability and his usefulness and the specific quality of a man who made a wrong choice from misplaced loyalty rather than malice, and was currently sitting with the full weight of that wrong choice in his face. Luca filed it. That accounting would happen later, in a separate room, in a different register. He turned back to Ferrante. Get up, he said. Ferrante looked at the men against the back wall. They had not moved during any of this. Marco's 2 men at the door had communicated, without a word, the specific mathematics of the room. Ferrante's men were 3 to Marco's 4, in a space that favored the door, and the man who controlled the door controlled the conversation. Ferrante's men stood against the wall and waited. Ferrante stood up. You're going to tell me, Luca said, Everything about the Sella family's current operational interest in my organization. Every contact, every arrangement, every piece of information you've given them in the last 14 months. And then you're going to tell me about the 5 years before that. And you're going to do this tonight, completely, because the alternative, he paused, is that I give the complete documentation to the Sella family directly, with your name at the top, and let them draw their own conclusions about a man who has been working both sides and who has now been exposed to his primary. Ferrante stared at him. You know what they do to informants, Luca said. So do I. He held the man's gaze. Tell me everything and you walk away from the organization and from this city with your life and enough distance between you and the consequences to make something of it. That's the offer. It expires when we leave this room. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Luca counted them. All right, Ferrante said. His voice had changed. The directness was still there. It was a structural quality of his face. You couldn't remove it. But something beneath it had been replaced with the flat, exhausted tone of a man who has been running a long time and has just stopped. All right. They moved Ferrante to a secondary room down the corridor. Marco set up recording. Luca sat across the table from the man who had run his personal security for 4 years and had spent 5 years before that engineering the absence of everyone Luca had loved, and he listened. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Luca asked questions that were short and precise and let the silences work. Ferrante talked with the specific compressed efficiency of a man who has already made his peace with the talking and wants it finished. The recording ran. The picture that assembled itself was larger than Luca had known and exactly the shape he'd suspected. The Sella family had been running a long game play against the Moretti organization for 7 years. Not a direct assault, which they knew they couldn't win, but a patient infiltration. Ferrante had been their instrument. Caruso had been Ferrante's instrument. The separation of Luca and Elena had been one move in a longer sequence. Removing Luca's most stabilizing personal relationship at a critical period in his rise, keeping him isolated and driven by grief converted to ambition, making him easier to read and predict because a man without roots is a man whose behavior follows cleaner patterns. And Noah, the knowledge of Noah's existence had come to Ferrante through Caruso 18 months ago. When Caruso had encountered Elena's name on a routine monitoring sweep, he'd apparently never stopped running. Ferrante had sat on it, had mapped it, had built it into the next phase of the Cella play. A Moretti heir in civilian life was an extraordinary piece of leverage, the kind of asset you held until the moment when Luca's empire was large enough that the threat of destabilization was worth more than the act of destabilization itself. That moment, Ferrante said, had been this week. The gala. The announcement of Vanessa Sinclair as Luca's future. It had been the right time to surface Noah, to send Sella men to the property and demonstrate that the Moretti heir was reachable, to fracture Luca's authority with the lieutenants while he was dealing with the personal fallout. The plan had assumed Luca would be slower, had not accounted for Elena's documentation, had not accounted for the specific quality of a 5-year-old with storm cloud gray eyes who asked questions with the guileless accuracy of someone who didn't know yet what questions were dangerous. When Ferrante finished, Luca sat with it for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window of the secondary room and looked down at the street. Manhattan, on Christmas evening, quieter than usual, the snow reflecting the streetlights in a low amber glow across the wet pavement. His shoulder ached where it had impacted the wall frame this morning. The cut at his temple had closed, but the skin around it was swollen and had begun the specific deep throb of tissue registering its grievance hours after the fact. His left forearm, where the parallel lines ran, was stiff with the beginning of bruising. He breathed. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Elena's number. The phone he'd given her from the property before she left. He answered. "He's asking for you," she said. Her voice was steady in the particular way her voice was always steady when she was managing something beneath it. "He won't go to sleep until he knows you're... He wants to know if you're coming." Luca looked at the window, at the city below, at the amber-lit snow. "Tell him I'm on my way," he said. "Are you?" He looked back at the room, at Marco watching him from the door with the patient, reading attention of a man who has been beside him for 11 years and knows when to wait. At Ferrante sitting at the table, diminished, a threat that had been running for 7 years and had been reduced in 2 hours and 20 minutes to a recorded voice on a table. "One more thing," he said to Elena. "Then I'm done." He ended the call. He turned to Marco. "Get Caruso to the Meridian. I want him here before 8. Marco stepped out to make the call. Luca stood in the room alone with Ferrante for a moment. The man looked up at him with the flat, used-up expression of someone who has delivered everything he has to deliver and is now waiting to find out what the delivery costs. "The Sella family," Luca said. "Their underboss, Righetti. You have a direct line to him." "Yes." "You're going to use it," Luca said. "Tonight. You're going to arrange a meeting between me and Righetti for tomorrow morning." He paused. "You're going to tell him the Westchester operation was successful, that the situation is contained, that the asset is in hand." He held Ferrante's gaze. "Let him believe it until I'm in the room." Ferrante looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, a final assessment of the man across from him, recalibrating against the version he thought he'd understood for 4 years. "You're going to end it with the Cellas," Ferrante said. "Not just the play, the whole relationship." "Yes." "That's not a meeting," Ferrante said. "That's a trap." "Yes," Luca said again. A silence. Then Ferrante pulled out his phone with the deliberate, careful movement of a man who has made his choice and is committed to its consequences. He found the number. He looked at Luca once more, something in his face that was not, Luca recognized, without its own complicated quality. Not remorse exactly. Something more like the expression of a man who can see now the full shape of what he built and dismantled, and is sitting with the architecture of it. He placed the call. Luca listened to him set it up. The easy voice, the practiced manner, the specific performance of a man who has been running 2 conversations simultaneously for 7 years and can still find the register. Righetti on the other end, audible but not clear. Agreement reached. Location. Time. Ferrante ended the call and set the phone on the table. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 8 a.m. He's using the warehouse on the Hudson, the Sella family's legitimate import operation. He'll have 8 men. Luca nodded. He picked up his jacket from the chair and put it on. He moved toward the door. "Moretti!" Ferrante's voice behind him. He stopped. Did not turn. "The boy," Ferrante said. His voice had a quality in it that Luca had not heard from him before. Stripped of the professional register, something rougher beneath. "He looks like your father. The eyes." A pause. "I knew your father. I want you to know that I—" "Don't," Luca said. The word fell into the room and closed it. He walked out into the corridor and pulled the door shut behind him and stood for a moment in the quiet of the Meridian Club's second-floor hallway, the mahogany panels and the muted lighting and the distant sound of the dining room below, other men having other conversations, the ordinary architecture of power continuing its business on Christmas night. He put his hand against the wall, just for a moment, just to feel something solid. Then he straightened his jacket. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button for the lobby and watched the doors close on the corridor and on the room and on Dominic Ferrante sitting at the table with the phone in front of him and the diminished weight of a man who has run out of moves. The elevator went down. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. The Sella underboss was walking into a room expecting a controlled asset and finding Luca Moretti instead, with the complete documented record of 7 years of infiltration and 1 attempted operation against a 5-year-old child, and the specific quality of reckoning that came from a man who had spent the last 24 hours losing everything he'd built his grief around and finding out, underneath it, what he was actually willing to fight for. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Costa was waiting at the entrance, the car idling at the curb, the city doing its amber-lit Christmas night outside the glass. Luca went through the door and got in the car and said, "Take me to the boy." Costa pulled up to the building on West 54th at 9:17 in the evening. It was a residential tower that Luca held through a property company, the kind of address that didn't appear in organizational records, that existed in the category of assets he maintained for exactly these circumstances. The lobby attendant nodded without speaking. The elevator was waiting. He rode up to the 14th floor. The hallway was quiet. He found the unit and knocked twice and heard movement inside, and then Elena opened the door and looked at him. At the state of his face in better light than the Meridian had offered, at the set of his shoulders, at the particular quality of a man who has finished something and is standing on the other side of it. She stepped back to let him in. The apartment was warm. Someone had found, in the kitchen, enough to make a meal. There were dishes on the counter, a pan on the stove, the smell of something simple that had been cooked carefully. On the couch in the main room, Noah was asleep under a blanket, one arm hanging off the edge in the same way it had hung off the couch cushion in Westchester. The deck of Burns cards fanned across the cushion beside him, where they'd apparently fallen from a loosening hand. Lucas stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at his son sleeping and felt the same thing he'd felt in Westchester. That movement in the chest, large and without clean language. The thing that had no framework in any system he'd built for himself. He turned back to Elena. She was in the kitchen doorway watching him. "Sit down," she said quietly. "I'll look at your face." He sat at the kitchen table. She found a first aid kit in the bathroom. The apartment was stocked for contingencies. That had always been his way. And she came back and stood in front of him and looked at the cut at his temple with the focused, unsentimental attention of a woman who has been doing everything herself for 5 years and has gotten efficient about it. She cleaned it without asking him whether it hurt. It did. He said nothing. Her hands were steady. They had stopped shaking since the Westchester hallway. He watched her face while she worked, the concentration, the slight compression of her brows, the quality of a woman doing a small, precise thing well, and felt the 5 years in it, not as an abstraction, as the specific weight of time that had been lived in his absence. "Ferrante," she said. Not a question. She was applying closure tape to the cut with 2 fingers. "Handled," he said. "And the Sella family?" "Tomorrow morning." He paused. "It ends tomorrow." She stepped back, looked at the tape, looked at his face, said nothing for a moment. "What does that mean?" she said. "Ends." He looked at her steadily. "It means I go into a room with the man who authorized the operation against Noah, and I make the consequences of that decision clear enough that he understands, completely, what the Moretti organization's response will be to any future interest in my son." He paused. "It means the Sella family's play against the organization is documented, exposed to every affiliate we share territory with, and the political cost of continuing it outweighs any possible gain." He held her gaze. "It means Noah won't be running from anything after tomorrow." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her face. Not relief, not yet. Something more provisional than relief. The expression of a woman who has been handed a promise that she wants to believe and is holding at a small distance until it proves itself. "I made him a promise too," Lucas said, "earlier, that I'd be here." "I know," she said. "He made me check the door 3 times. He looked at the doorway to the main room, at Noah's sleeping shape on the couch. "You should sleep," Elena said. "Not yet." She looked at him. Then she moved to the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee from what remained in the pot and set one in front of him and sat across the table with the other. The kitchen light was low and the apartment was quiet, and outside the window the city was doing its Christmas night with the muted, amber-edged quality of a city that doesn't fully stop but gets softer at the edges in the cold. He reached into his jacket and put the fireproof box on the table between them. He'd had Marco retrieve it from the storage unit before leaving the Meridian. The box sat there. 43 envelopes, his name in her handwriting on each one. She looked at the box. Something in her face went still. "I want to read them," he said. "I told you I would." "Now?" "I need to know what the 5 years were," he said. "Not the operational picture, not the threat assessment. What they were for you." He paused. "I need to know what I missed." She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the box and then at the table and then at him. "Some of them are angry," she said. "Good. Some of them are—" She stopped. "I wrote them at night mostly, after he went to sleep. I wasn't performing anything when I wrote them. I want you to understand that before you open them." "I understand." She nodded once. She reached out and opened the box. She looked at the envelopes and then she did something he hadn't anticipated. She took the one on the top, the most recent, and she opened it herself and she read it once silently and then she set it down in front of him. It was 4 pages, handwritten, dated 11 months ago. He read it. It took him 8 minutes. He read it the way he read operational intelligence, completely, with full attention, letting nothing pass unmarked. But it was not intelligence. It was a woman writing at a kitchen table after her son had gone to sleep, writing to the person she had spent 5 years being unable to reach, writing with the specific unguarded honesty that comes from writing something you believe will never be read. He read it and set it down and looked at the table. "All right," he said. His voice came out different than he intended. He cleared it, tried again. "All right." Elena was watching him. Her jaw was set in the way it set when she was holding something. "You don't have to do all of them tonight," she said. "I know." He looked at the box. "I'll do the rest when there's time." He looked up at her. "But I needed to know the shape of it. What I was asking you to—" He stopped. He was not a man who had much practice with sentences that didn't complete themselves with clean precision. He tried again. "I needed to know what it cost you, before I ask you for anything else." She looked at him across the kitchen table, and her face had the quality of complete openness. Not vulnerability exactly, not the thing that can be taken advantage of, but the specific openness of a person who has decided to stop performing for the present moment and let it be what it is. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. He thought about what he had that he could offer her and what the honest accounting of it was. A man who had spent 15 years becoming something that existed in the space between power and damage, who had built an empire out of grief and methodology and the substitution of ambition for the things that ambition cannot replace. A man who was 41 years old and had only tonight, sitting at a kitchen table with a first aid kit and 43 letters and a sleeping child in the next room, begun to understand what the empire had cost. "I'm not asking you to forgive the 5 years," he said. "I'm not asking you to forget what it was to do that alone." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to let me be in the room, from here. Whatever that looks like, whatever shape that takes that you can live with. I'm asking to be in the room." She was quiet. The heating system ran its low note. Outside, a car moved on the street below, its sound traveling up through the window glass and going. "You should know," she said, "that he's going to have questions. When he understands who you are, what you do. He's 5, but he's not—" She paused. "He notices things. He's been asking about his father since he was 3. Not in a wounded way. More like—" She searched for the word. "Inventory. He wants the complete picture. He'll want the complete picture of you." "I know. And you're going to have to decide what to tell him. I'm not going to make that decision for you." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm also not going to lie to him on your behalf. Whatever you tell him has to be something you can live with him knowing." "Understood," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her posture settled, something that had been held at a specific tension releasing by a degree. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to be visible, enough to be a movement in the right direction. "Okay," she said. He looked at her across the table. He thought about the night he'd put the pendant around her neck, the angle of light, the weight of chain in his fingers, the certainty he'd felt. He had been right about the certainty. He had simply been wrong about its durability in the face of what other people could do to it. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. The apology surprised her. He could see that. He was not a man who apologized as a reflex. She understood that the word was precise. "For what specifically?" she said. "For believing it," he said. "When they told me you'd left. For not— I had resources. I had people. I could have looked harder than I did. After the first month, I told myself a story about what it meant, and I used it." He paused. "I was angrier than I was grieving, and I used the anger to make it clean." She was quiet for a moment. "I wrote you a letter about that," she said. "About 6 months in, I was very articulate on the subject of your anger." "I'd imagine." Something moved through her face, something that was almost, not quite, not yet, the beginning of something lighter. Not a smile. The distant precursor of one. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. He sat at that kitchen table across from Elena Rossi until past midnight. They talked and did not talk in the specific rhythm of two people who have a long way to cover and have begun to understand that it will not be covered in one night. He told her what had happened at the Meridian in enough detail for her to understand the shape of what was resolved and what remained. She told him things about the 5 years that were not in any letter. Small things, logistical things, the texture of what it had actually been to move and manage and keep a child safe and make a business work and do all of it alone. He listened in the way he listened to important information, completely. without interruption. At 12:38, Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was standing in his pajamas with his hair sideways from sleep and his eyes at the specific half-mast of a child who has woken in an unfamiliar place and is running orientation checks. He saw his mother at the table. He saw Luca. He looked between them with the unhurried assessment that was apparently his fundamental mode. "You came," he said to Luca, stated. Not surprised exactly, more confirming a hypothesis. "I said I would," Luca said. Noah considered this. He padded to the table in his socked feet and stood beside it and looked at the box of letters and then at the 2 cups, and then at his mother with a look that said he was aware that something significant had been happening in this kitchen and was categorizing it as adult business that he would be briefed on at an appropriate time. Then he looked at Luca. "Your face looks bad," he said. "It feels bad," Luca said. "Does it hurt?" "Some?" Noah reached out and very carefully with 2 fingers touched the edge of the closure tape at Luca's temple. Not the wound itself, but the edge of it, the way a child touches something that concerns them with the maximum available gentleness. Then he withdrew his hand and looked at Luca with the gray eyes that Luca was still learning the full language of. "Mom's good at fixing things," Noah said. "She fixed my head when I fell off the back fence. There was a lot of blood." He said this with the slightly proud retrospection of a child reviewing a significant personal event. "I didn't cry." "I believe it," Luca said. Noah looked at him for another moment. Then he came around the table and climbed into the chair next to Luca. The 3rd chair, the one that had been empty, with the physical certainty of a child claiming a space that he has decided belongs to him. He sat with his elbows on the table and looked at his mother. "Is it Christmas still?" he asked. Elena looked at her phone. "For about 20 more minutes." Noah absorbed this. "I didn't get to open anything," he said. The tone was informational rather than complaining, a child filing a factual grievance for the record. "I know," Elena said. "We'll do Christmas tomorrow, or the next day. We'll do it when we're home." "Where's home?" Noah asked. The question was genuine, the question of a child for whom home had been a movable thing. Elena opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at Luca. Luca looked at Noah. The boy was watching him with the complete, unfiltered attention that he brought to everything. "That's something we're going to figure out," Luca said. "Together, the 3 of us." He paused. "If that's all right with you." Noah thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. He looked at his mother. She gave him no direction with her face. She was letting it be his. He looked back at Luca. "Do you have a house?" he asked. "Several," Luca said. Noah blinked. "Like more than 2? "Yes." "Okay," Noah said, with the pragmatic acceptance of a 5-year-old for whom this resolves a logistics question satisfactorily. He looked at the box of letters. "What's in the box?" "Letters," Luca said. "Your mother wrote them." "To who?" "To me." Noah looked at Elena. She was looking at her hands on the table. "Did he read them?" Noah asked her. "One," Elena said. "He'll read the rest later." Noah turned this over. He had the quality, Luca was cataloging it, adding it to the small growing inventory of who this person was, of sitting with information until he understood its full weight before moving on. "Was it a sad letter?" he asked. Luca thought about the 4 pages, the kitchen table and the honesty and the 5 years rendered in unguarded ink. "Parts of it," he said. "Did it make you sad?" He looked at the boy, at the gray eyes and the clear, waiting face. "Yes," he said. "It did." Noah nodded, as if this was the correct answer. He reached out and put his small hand on Luca's forearm, not the bruised one, the other, and left it there for a moment with the simple, instinctive comfort of a child who has watched his mother fix things and understands that some fixing is done with presence rather than tools. Then he took his hand back and said, "Can I have something to eat? I'm hungry." The morning came gray and cold. Elena and Noah slept. Luca did not. He sat with the box of letters until 4 a.m. He read them in order from the earliest, 3 weeks after the separation, when the anger was still fresh and specific and articulate in the way that early grief is articulate because the wound is clean, through the middle ones, which were different, quieter, which described Noah's first words and first steps, and the particular quality of his laugh that Luca had not yet heard, and through the later ones, the most recent, which had a different quality again. Not resolved, not healed, but something that had found its level. The writing of a woman who has integrated loss into the structure of her days and found that it doesn't diminish. It just becomes part of the load you carry, and eventually you carry it without thinking about it, which is not the same as it being gone. He read all 43. He put them back in the box and put the box on the table and sat for a while with his hands flat on the table in the quiet of the apartment and let the full accounting settle. At 6:45, he made 2 calls. The first was to Marco. The warehouse meeting was confirmed. The documentation was in position. The affiliates had been briefed overnight through channels that Ferrante had never had access to. Gerace had brought Caruso in at 11 p.m. quietly from his Westchester house, the man apparently offering no resistance, only the flat exhaustion of someone for whom the running had already ended in his own head before the knock came at the door. Caruso was in a room with Ricci and the attorney Benedetti and was, by Marco's account, talking freely with the specific release of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has been handed the opportunity to put it down. The second call was to Vanessa. He made this one from the kitchen while the apartment slept around him. It was early, and she answered on the third ring with a voice that was alert. She had always slept lightly, another quality he had respected. "I've been waiting," she said. No anger in it. Careful. "I know." He paused. "You saw who she was." A silence. "I saw a woman take a child away from you very quickly," Vanessa said. "I know what that kind of quick looks like." Another pause. "And I saw your face afterward, at the announcement." "I was fine at the announcement." "Luca." Her voice was even, measured. "I've spent 18 months learning your face. You were not fine at the announcement." She was quiet for a moment. "Is the child yours?" "Yes," he said. The silence on her end had a specific quality. Not devastation. Vanessa was not built for visible devastation. Something more structural. The sound of a woman remapping a picture she had thought she understood. "Tell me what you need me to know," she said. He told her. Not everything. Not the operational picture, not the cella detail, not Ferrante. But the truth of it. A son he hadn't known existed. A woman he had loved and lost by design rather than by choice. The 5 years and what they'd been built on. He told her cleanly, without softening it and without being cruel about it, because Vanessa deserved the actual truth, delivered with the respect that 18 months and her genuine quality of character had earned. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. "The announcement," she said. "You'll need to walk it back." "Yes." "I'll handle my side of that," she said. I'm not going to make that difficult for you." A pause. "I want you to know that I understood, going in, what I was. You were clear about what you could offer. I don't have a grievance about the honest parts." Another pause, shorter. "The part I have a grievance about is that you let last night happen without knowing what you were walking into." "That's fair," he said. "Yes, it is." Her voice was dry and precise and completely steady. He respected her enormously in that moment. "I hope he's a good boy," she said. "Your son." "He is," as Luca said. "He is." She ended the call. He sat for a moment with the phone on the table. Some debts got paid cleanly and some didn't, and you lived with the difference. He went to the warehouse at 7:45. The Hudson waterfront in the early morning was a particular kind of cold, the river adding its own weight to the air, the loading docks quiet, the city at a remove. Marco was already there with Garas and 4 men, the documentation assembled, the position prepared. Righetti arrived at 8:14. He was 60, solid, the face of a man who had built his position through patience rather than aggression, and who had underestimated, Luca suspected, the specific quality of patience that Luca carried in return. He came in with 6 men and looked at the room and at Luca and understood, immediately, that the asset situation he'd been promised was not the situation he'd arrived in. The conversation that followed lasted 51 minutes. It was not a negotiation in the ordinary sense. Luca did not raise his voice. He laid the documentation on the table the same way he'd laid it in front of the lieutenants the night before. Let it speak for itself first. Let the weight of it settle. and then spoke on top of that weight with the complete clarity of a man who has decided what the terms are and is not interested in counter-proposals. The terms were these. The Cella family's operation inside the Moretti organization was finished, documented, and would be distributed to every family affiliate on the Eastern Seaboard within 48 hours if Righetti declined. The Westchester operation would be characterized, in that documentation, as an attack on a civilian child, which it was, and the political cost of that characterization within the criminal ecosystem, where the unwritten rules about families and children existed for everyone's mutual interest, would be severe and permanent. The alternative, Righetti acknowledged the play, recalled his remaining assets from Moretti territory, and accepted the boundary as redrawn. No further interest in Luca's organization, no further interest in Luca's son. The documentation stayed in a room. Righetti sat with it for 7 minutes. He was a patient man. He ran his calculations. He looked at Luca across the table, at the state of his face, at the stillness that Luca brought to rooms, at the specific quality of a man who has passed through the version of himself that could be manipulated through grief and come out the other side of it. And he made his decision. "The boy," Righetti said, "he's acknowledged, formally, as yours." "As of this morning," Luca said. "Yes." "Then we have no further business with your family," Righetti said. He said it with the specific phrasing of a man who understands that some statements carry the weight of contract, or with anyone connected to it. He stood up. His men moved. They went out through the warehouse door into the cold river morning, and the sound of their cars carried and then faded, and then the waterfront was quiet. Luca sat in the warehouse for a moment after they left. Marco stood at the far wall and did not speak. Gerace stood beside him with the posture of a man who has witnessed a resolution and is filing it appropriately. Then Luca stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Marco. "Ferrante," he said. "Caruso. Whatever Benedetti and Ricci have assembled, take it to the attorney for formal filing. Let the legal side run what it can run." He paused. "The rest is organizational discipline. Handle it the way it gets handled." Marco nodded. "And Marco." He looked at the man who had been beside him for 11 years. "Take Christmas. Whatever's left of it." Marco blinked. He was not a man who blinked visibly as a general rule. "It's the 26th, he said. "Then take the 26th, Luca said. He drove back to West 54th. Noah was awake when he arrived, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with Burns cards organized into something that appeared to be an invented game with rules that were not immediately apparent. He looked up when Luca came through the door with the specific, calibrated attention he brought to everything. "You were gone," he said. "I had something to finish," Luca said. "It's finished." Noah looked at him for a moment. He appeared to be determining whether this constituted satisfactory information. He decided it did. "Do you know how to play cards?" he asked. "Some games," Luca said. "I invented a new one," Noah said. "I'll teach you. It's complicated." Luca took off his jacket and hung it on the chair and sat down on the floor across from his son, with the deck of cards between them and the morning light coming through the apartment window at a low winter angle, and he said, "Show me." Elena appeared from the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs. She took in the scene, Luca on the floor, Noah already explaining the rules of the invented card game with the focused intensity of a designer presenting work they believe in. And something moved through her face that was too layered to name, but which settled, finally, into something that was not quite peace, but was pointed in peace's direction. She sat on the couch and tucked her feet beneath her and held her mug and watched them. Noah's game had rules that shifted slightly as he explained them, modified in real time to cover logical gaps that Luca's questions exposed. Luca asked his questions with complete seriousness. He didn't condescend and he didn't perform interest. He was genuinely interested, in the specific particular way that he was interested in systems and their internal logic. Noah noticed this. I expanded the explanation. They played 2 rounds. Luca lost the first. He wasn't certain the second round's outcome was fully governed by the stated rules, but he let it go. After the second round, Noah gathered the cards and began reshuffling with the meditative, restless handling that Luca had seen the night before. He looked up between shuffles. "Are you going to live with us?" he asked. The question arrived with the clean, unqualified directness of a person for whom social filtration has not yet been fully installed. Luca looked at him. He looked at Elena over the boy's head. She was watching, not intervening, letting the answer be whatever it was going to be. I'm going to be around, Luca said. A lot. Every day, if you want that. What does that mean? Noah said. Around. It means you won't have to ask where I am, Luca said. It means when I say I'm coming, I come. Noah considered this with the focused, careful processing that was, Luca was understanding, the fundamental way the boy engaged with important information. He had inherited something from both of them, Elena's methodical patience and Luca's instinct for the load-bearing question. Okay, Noah said. He resumed shuffling. Then, without looking up, you have the same eyes as me. I know, Luca said. That's because you're my dad, Noah said, still without looking up. Stated with the simple, factual certainty of a child who has been running a hypothesis for a while and has arrived, through available evidence, at a conclusion. The word landed in the room, not like an explosion, like something settling, like the sound a lock makes when the right key finally turns in it, quiet and complete. Yes, Luca said. Noah nodded once, the same single nod he'd given in the upstairs hallway in Westchester when Luca had told him it was safe, the nod of someone receiving information they've decided to trust. He set the cards down in a neat stack between them. Okay, he said again. Outside the window, the city moved through its first full day after Christmas, cabs and foot traffic, and the low gray sky over the rooftops doing what the sky did after the storm, holding its cold with the particular stillness of weather that has done its work. The snow on the window ledge was softening at the edges in the morning air, beginning the long, slow process of returning to something else. Luca sat on the floor of an apartment on West 54th Street with a deck of cards between him and his son and the woman he had lost and found in the same 24 hours sitting on the couch behind them, and he breathed, in and out. The shoulder still ached. The cut at his temple registered its presence in the low, persistent way of healing things. He looked at Noah's hands moving the cards. The same hands, essentially. The same proportions. The same way the fingers moved with more dexterity than the age suggested. The same slight leftward cant when the movement was precise. He had not noticed it last night. He noticed it now. All the things he had not noticed yet. All the things he would learn. He looked up at Elena. She was watching him with the expression she had worn in the kitchen at midnight. That provisional, careful thing that was moving, by degrees, towards something it hadn't allowed itself to be in 5 years. She held his gaze. He held hers. There was no clean resolution to the 5 years. There was no gesture large enough to account for them, no sentence that settled the balance. What there was a morning. What there was the next hour, and the hour after that, and the slow accumulation of hours that would either build something or wouldn't, and the only thing that determined which was whether you showed up for them. He had spent 5 years building an empire out of the absence of this. The empire stood. It would continue to stand. He was not a man who dismantled what he built, and he was not going to perform transformation for anyone's benefit. He was what he was, and what he was would not change because a child had asked him a question in a ballroom. But what he was for, that had changed. That had changed at approximately the moment a 5-year-old with storm-cloud eyes had put 2 fingers on the edge of a wound with maximum available gentleness. And the difference between those 2 things, what you are and what you are for, turned out to be the size of everything. Noah dealt the cards for a 3rd round of the invented game, distributing them with the focused seriousness of an officiator. He dealt 3 to Luca, 3 to himself, and then looked at the couch. "Mom," he said, "you should play." Elena set her mug down. She unfolded herself from the couch and came and sat on the floor beside them and held out her hand for her cards. Noah dealt 3 to her with the same ceremony. He looked between them, his mother on one side, his father on the other, the cards in his hands, and the gray winter light coming through the window, and the whole complicated, unfinished, living thing of it arranged around him on an apartment floor on the day after Christmas. "Okay," he said, with the complete authority of someone opening something that belongs to him. "I'll explain the rules again from the beginning." And he did.